This ratio problem is giving you a feel on what's involved in the return on equity. How much of it is because you're representing your stockholders well and providing higher returns, and how much of it is because of risk. So here what we have is the following: is Central City Construction Company, which is just being formed, need $1 million of assets. And it expects to have a basic earning power, that's the earnings before interest and tax divided by assets, of 20%. Central City will own no securities, so all of its income is going to be operating. So we really want to concentrate on efficiency versus risk. If it chooses to, Central City can finance up to 50% of its assets with debt, which will have an 8% interest rate. So we want to look at two different scenarios: a 0% debt financing and the potential of 50% debt. What is it that debt does for you? Assuming we have a 40% tax rate on all taxable income, what it asks for is what's the difference between its expected return on equity if they finance with 50% debt versus its expected ROE if it finances entirely with common stock. So this is a lead-in to where we're going to begin to talk eventually about the DuPont expansion, which will measure this explicitly, but here just to try to illustrate what's going on with this. So we have two scenarios we want to look at. That would be a debt-to-asset ratio that is at 0%, so you just finance it all by equity, versus a 50% ratio. And what we want to know here is what is it that's going to happen with that return on equity in either of these circumstances. Now, you're given right here something on the basic earning power is 20%. So we can find out what the EBIT is because you've got some information here on your assets. So if your assets are $1 million and earnings before interest and taxes relative to the assets represents 20%, then if we simply take that 20% and multiply it by the $1 million in assets, we have a figure for EBIT. Now, what we're looking for here is what is it that's going to happen as you work your way down in order to get to net income, because we've got some information that's provided right here in terms of here's your EBIT, we've got the same tax rate in each circumstance, and it's a question of whether or not you have a reduction here in order to have debt financing. Now, in the case of 0% financing, what we go is we're going to have EBIT and we're going to subtract off nothing for an interest expense. If there's no debt, there's no interest expense. So the EBIT figure also represents the notion of earnings before tax. So to come up with the net income, then what we're going to do is we're going to take this 200,000 figure, which is the earnings before taxes, multiply it by 1 minus the tax rate, and we've got a tax rate here of 40%. That figure at that point in time, if we just looked right here, would be indicative of, let me put that in dollar terms, excuse me. So you've got $120,000 would be your net income in that case, versus what we would have for our net income in the latter case, where you would be subtracting off. So let me just put that same formatting in here. In the case of 50% debt, what we're going to have is a EBIT of $200,000. From that, we're going to subtract off our interest expense. So here, we're going to pay an 8% interest. That's going to be based on half of this. So 50% debt times the $1 million in assets, and that would say, well, in this case, what we've got here is earnings before taxes of $160,000. You would then subtract out your taxes, so what we would have left is this time 1 minus the tax rate of 40%. And the effect here would be to remove your net income down to $96,000 in this instance. Now, we want to look at that relative to the level of equity. So in the first case here, with EBIT of $200,000 and a $120,000 return on that equity, In the denominator here, the amount of equity would be all of your assets, okay, since you have no debt. So when we look in here, and let's change this now to a percentage so you can see what this return would be. What we're getting is exactly a 12% return on equity. Now, in the second case where we had 50% in the form of debt, what we saw is that our net income figure went down to $96,000. But remember that that net income figure that we have is relative to a much smaller level of assets. And here what we've got for assets, or for equity, excuse me, is $1 million times 1 minus this debt to asset ratio. So instead of $1 million in equity, we only have $500,000, and $96,000 relative to a $500,000 level of equity is going to give us a return on equity of 19.2%. So it asked us here for the difference. So what we can see is the fact that we've changed nothing in operations. If you remember this, it was entirely funded by operations. So we've done nothing different in terms of our operations. We've been able to increase the return to our equity holders by up to 7.2%. Okay, it's gone up from 12% to 19.2% without doing anything towards operations. The only thing that we did is we made ourselves riskier by going from 0% in debt up to 50% in debt. So you see here the power of this, and we want to be able to identify, has management improved things by getting our earnings before interest and taxes up, or have they simply made us riskier, as we're observing in this case?